He was not the kind of man you would expect to stand at the crossroads of a nation's fate. David Wilkerson never sought fame, never wanted an audience large enough to echo through generations. Yet somehow, the quiet pastor from a small Pennsylvania town became a voice whose warnings would outlive him, stretching like a long shadow into an era he never witnessed, a time of riots, political fury, collapsing trust, and a leader whose presence would split America down the center. Long before the nation even imagined the name Donald Trump in a political sentence, Wilkerson spoke of a day when the foundations of American power would tremble, not from foreign enemies, but from something rising inside the nation itself. The man who would one day be seen as a reluctant prophet began his journey not with visions of storms and collapse, but with a burden he could not explain. In the late 1950s, while most preachers sought comfort, he sold his television, pushed aside the safety of home, and walked into the streets of New York City, a place then swallowed by gang violence, broken families, and addiction so deep it had become part of the city's breath. He did not carry eloquent sermons or polished charisma. He carried an ache he believed came from God, an ache that insisted someone must go where hope had burned down to embers. Those early years altered him. They carved a man who knew the cost of human darkness, who had touched the faces of boys soaked in blood, who had prayed in apartments where needles littered the floor like broken promises. It was there he founded Teen Challenge, a ministry that would rescue thousands not by entertainment, not by marketing, but by confronting the soul. It was also there, in the rawness of human suffering, that something awakened in him. He began to speak not only of what he saw in front of him, but of storms forming beyond the horizon, storms that many dismissed as exaggeration, fear-mongering, or imagination. But to those who listened, there was something different about his voice. It carried the weight of someone who had stood too close to the edge and survived. Someone who spoke not for applause, but because silence felt like disobedience. By the early 1970s, that voice deepened into something more unsettling. He said he began to feel a trembling inside his spirit, a heaviness he could not shake. He spent hours in prayer, often pacing alone in his study, wrestling with impressions he did not want to share. But eventually the weight grew too heavy to ignore, and he wrote the book that would define his legacy, The Vision, published in 1973. It was not a collection of poetic warnings or symbolic metaphors. It was blunt, it was specific, it was disturbing. It spoke of riots erupting across American cities, of deep confusion overtaking the lives of young people, of churches abandoning truth for comfort, of sexual chaos spreading like wildfire. And it described an economic shock that would strike without warning, not slowly like a traditional recession, but suddenly, violently, like a trapdoor collapsing beneath an entire nation. At the time, it sounded impossible. America was strong, confident, prosperous. The idea of the nation turning against itself, streets burning, cities descending into chaos, leaders stoking division, people losing trust in every institution seemed like fiction. Yet Wilkerson insisted he wasn't predicting out of imagination. He said he trembled as he wrote it, not wanting the responsibility of publishing something so heavy. Years later, when riots burst across major cities, when banks collapsed under the weight of a financial crisis, when division seeped into every conversation, many began to reread his words with new eyes, as if the pages had been waiting for a generation not yet born when he first wrote them. But the most haunting part of his message wasn't the list of calamities. It was the deeper, quieter idea beneath them, that the nation's shaking would come through a leader, one who would not bring unity, but exposure. A leader who would force the hidden sickness of the country into the open, as if holding a mirror up to the heart of America. Wilkerson never mentioned a name. He never predicted a political figure, never endorsed or condemned anyone. Yet he spoke repeatedly of a moment when America would be gripped by a divisive force. A presence that would unravel what was hidden, stir what was buried, and ignite a level of conflict so intense it would feel spiritual in nature, not merely political. For decades, his words floated in the background, too vague to pin to any individual, too unsettling to dwell on. But then came an era no one expected, an era defined by a man whose every word stirred passion or anger, whose presence alone was polarizing enough to split families, churches, and entire communities. He was not a man of soft language or gentle diplomacy. He confronted, provoked, agitated, exposed. Whether admired or despised, he could not be ignored. And suddenly, people began to ask whether this was the kind of figure Wilkerson had spoken about, not because of political policies, not because of ideology, but because of the reaction, the shaking, the way the nation seemed to fracture along every line at once. Moral, racial, spiritual, economic, ideological, the way hidden things, corruption, bitterness, deception, rose into plain sight. To some, the answer was clear. To others, it was coincidence. But to many who had followed Wilkerson's words for years, it began to feel as though the storm he warned about had finally touched the shoreline. This first section is not about deciding whether he was right or wrong. It is about stepping into the tension he created, standing beside a man who believed he saw something coming, long before any of us recognized its shape. His warnings no longer feel like echoes from a distant past. They feel like a door we are only now opening, a door leading into a story still unfolding around us. And as we cross that threshold, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The storm he described did not begin with politics, and it will not end with it. Something deeper, older, and more spiritual is at play. Something he believed could only be understood by looking beyond the headlines into the realm where truth and deception collide. It began quietly, almost too quietly for anyone to notice. The early pages of the vision were dismissed as the musings of a concerned pastor, the kind of warnings preachers have spoken for centuries. But Wilkerson insisted what he saw did not rise from fear or pessimism. It came like a burden placed on him, something he wished he could ignore but could not escape. And as the years turned, his words aged not like predictions, but like seeds buried, dormant, waiting for the right season to bloom. When that season arrived, it did not come with trumpets or banners. It came with subtle fractures, small, hairline cracks in the confidence of a nation. Cracks that would one day widen into chasms. The first of those cracks took shape in the streets. Riots erupting with a ferocity that seemed unthinkable for modern America. Storefronts smashed in broad daylight. Cities plunged into chaos. Police overwhelmed, flames rising in the night. Wilkerson had described this image decades earlier, writing of fires that would burn in major cities, of rebellion spreading like an unrestrained fever. At the time, critics accused him of dramatizing, exaggerating, or projecting the violence he had witnessed in gang-ridden New York onto the nation at large. But years later, when the streets filled with crowds, some desperate, some angry, some simply swept by the tide of unrest, the echoes of his warnings felt eerily familiar. There was a moment in those riots, captured on 1,000 phone screens, when the glow of fire against the night sky looked almost like an old prophecy catching flame, and people began whispering, "He saw this. He said this would happen." Yet the fire in the streets was only the surface. The deeper unraveling, the one he feared most, took place in the heart of the church. Wilkerson warned that a time would come when churches across America, once the moral anchor of the nation, would loosen their grip on truth. They would drift, not with sudden betrayal, but with slow compromise. They would become places of comfort rather than conviction, platforms for applause rather than altars for repentance. He said leaders would fall into scandal, congregations would trade holiness for entertainment, and messages from the pulpit would soften until sin no longer sounded like a danger, only a misunderstanding. And for many, this was the warning that felt the most unbelievable. Churches, the places people trusted, the communities seen as moral centers, how could they crumble? But as the years passed, stories emerged, one church after another swallowed by scandal, secrecy, moral collapse, a parade of headlines so frequent that people stopped being shocked. Megachurches swelling in size while shrinking in substance, messages crafted to inspire but stripped of the cross, services designed to entertain but void of the altar. Wilkerson's words took on a new sharpness. There will be churches packed with people, but empty in spiritual depth. It was as though he had peered decades ahead and seen sanctuaries full of lights, smoke machines, and applause yet hollow, echoing like empty shells. But perhaps the most painful fulfillment of his warnings was found among the young. He spoke of a generation that would grow up without foundation, without direction, and without the ability to distinguish truth from deception. A generation lost not because they rejected meaning, but because no one had shown them where to find it. He described their confusion not merely as cultural, but spiritual, a darkness settling over their minds, a fog that obscured purpose. And as recent years unfolded, the signs became impossible to ignore. Anxiety soared, depression became an epidemic, identity fractured into countless pieces, trust in institutions, government, media, religion, even family crumbled like dried clay. Young people wandered through a digital world saturated with information but starving for truth. When Wilkerson wrote about a deep spiritual darkness rising among youth, people thought it too dramatic. But today, when we look at rising loneliness, crisis-level mental health statistics, and the growing belief that life lacks meaning, his words feel less like warnings and more like history recorded in advance. Then came the economic shaking, something he described with chilling precision. He spoke of banks collapsing without warning, of unemployment skyrocketing overnight, of a fear that would grip the nation as people saw the fragility of systems they once trusted. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit with brutal suddenness, many turned to his writings again. They realized he had described the global collapse decades earlier, almost line for line. But even then, he said, this is only the beginning. A greater shaking is yet to come. That greater shaking, he insisted, would not be about money alone. It would expose the heart. It would reveal the false securities people clung to. It would force a nation to confront the uncomfortable truth that prosperity had become an idol. Faith had become shallow, and trust had shifted from God to the machinery of finance. And now, as inflation rises, debts swell, and economic anxiety grows, like a shadow stretching across the nation. Many wonder if we are watching the early tremors of the collapse. He described a collapse not designed to punish, but to awaken. Everything he warned about seemed connected by one thread. The shaking would start inside, not outside. America would not be undone by enemies abroad, but by the spiritual emptiness festering beneath its own surface. What makes these fulfillments so unnerving is not that they happened individually. Countries have always faced unrest, moral struggles, and financial crises. It is that they happened together, in a pattern, in a sequence, aligning like notes in a song written long before the melody began. A convergence of events that looked less like coincidence and more like the shape of a storm. And in that convergence, people began to see something else, a silhouette forming in the center of the chaos. A figure who would not create the storm, but would reveal it. Someone who would step into the national stage and ignite every fracture at once, forcing the nation to confront what lay hidden beneath the surface. A leader who would divide, expose, and tear open the wounds Wilkerson said were already festering. For many, that figure emerged unmistakably in the modern era, and whether he came as a warning or a judgment, or simply a mirror reflecting the nation's soul, the timing made one thing impossible to deny. The storm Wilkerson described had begun to take form long before any of us realized it was coming. He never said the name, not once. In all the decades David Wilkerson preached, pleaded, and trembled before the messages he believed God had placed in his spirit, he never identified a political figure, never pointed to a specific leader as the spark that would ignite the national shaking he foresaw. And yet, as the years passed and history turned sharply in an unexpected direction, many found themselves looking back at his words with a jolt of recognition, as if the silhouette he described had finally stepped out of the shadows and onto the national stage. Wilkerson warned repeatedly of a coming leader who would not soothe the nation but expose it. A figure who would not unite but divide, whose very presence would act like a blade separating bone from marrow, revealing what had been festering in silence. He said this person would stir emotions so fierce, so absolute, that neutrality would become impossible. People would either cling to him with fervent loyalty or reject him with visceral outrage. There would be no middle ground, no quiet corners left untouched. For many, those words found their echo in Donald J. Trump. Not because of policy, not because of ideology, but because of the reaction, because of the shaking that followed him like a storm front. When Trump arrived on the political scene, he did not enter quietly. He did not blend into the landscape of familiar politicians with polished speeches and rehearsed decorum. He entered like a disruptor, a spark dropped into a field of dry grass. And almost instantly the flames spread. Families divided, churches argued, longtime friendships snapped in half. The nation fractured along lines that had always existed but were now pulled taut, exposed, and brought to the surface with violent clarity. Emotions swirled like whirlwinds. Outrage mingled with devotion, accusations clashed with declarations. And beneath it all, something deeper stirred, something spiritual, invisible, and yet unmistakably real. It was this deeper stirring that made many look back to Wilkerson's old warnings with unease. Because Wilkerson said the shaking would not come from the leader's character but from the nation's response. He said the leader would be like a mirror, harsh, unfiltered, and unavoidable, revealing the wounds of the people, the hypocrisy of the institutions, the corruption of the powerful, and the spiritual emptiness running through the veins of the culture. And that, more than anything else, became the heart of the connection. During Trump's rise, the hidden sicknesses Wilkerson spoke of burst into the open like long-sealed wounds torn apart. Corruption in media, manipulation in politics, secrets buried in institutions, divisions in churches, pride in pulpits, fear in congregations. The fault lines were always there, but under the pressure of a single, polarizing figure, they widened, cracked, and split the landscape of the nation. Trump did not create those fractures. He revealed them, just as Wilkerson said the coming leader would. He spoke of a time when the nation would be forced into a moment of decision, when truth and deception would collide openly, when people would not simply disagree, but rage against one another with a heat that felt almost spiritual, not intellectual, not political, spiritual, as if something unseen had woven itself into the national conversation, twisting every debate into a battle for identity, meaning, and survival. That is why so many see in Trump the fulfillment not of a prophecy naming him, but of a prophecy describing a catalyst, a breaker of illusions. A man whose flaws, boldness, and unpredictability acted as a spotlight scanning across the nation, revealing what lay hidden in both darkness and light. To some, he was a defender, a bulwark against forces they believed threatened their values. To others, he was a destroyer, a symbol of chaos and division. But to Wilkerson's listeners, the polarization itself was the sign, not the politics, not the speeches, not the policies. The division. Wilkerson said, a leader would rise whose presence would draw out what people truly believed, what they feared, what they worshipped, what they trusted. A leader who would force the church to confront something it had long avoided, its own dependence on earthly power, its temptation to trade prayer for politics, its vulnerability to idols cloaked in patriotism or morality. And as Trump stood at the center of the nation's storm, many began to see the uncomfortable truth. People were revealing more about themselves than about him. Their hope, their anger, their loyalty, their desperation, their faith, or the lack of it. This is why the Trump era felt less like a political movement and more like a spiritual earthquake, because it matched the pattern Wilkerson described, a moment in which God allows what is hidden to be exposed. not to condemn, but to reveal, not to destroy, but to force a reckoning. In Wilkerson's vision, the leader who sparks the shaking is not the solution and not the enemy. He is the test. A figure who stands in the middle of a nation like a mirror held up to the world, reflecting what people worship, what they fear, and what they truly trust. And perhaps the most haunting part of his warning is this: the leader's role ends quickly. The shaking does not, because the purpose was never the leader. The purpose was exposure, the unveiling. And once something is unveiled, it cannot be unseen. Whether Trump fulfilled Wilkerson's pattern is a question each person must answer for themselves. But the deeper truth Wilkerson left behind is unavoidable. The storm was never about the man. It was about the nation, about what the nation revealed when the pressure arose, when the mirror was lifted, and when the shaking began. For in that shaking, Wilkerson believed the next chapter would begin, not with unity or triumph, but with a collapse far quieter, far deeper, and far more spiritual than anything a single leader could cause. The kind of collapse that forces people to choose what they truly stand on when the ground beneath them begins to break. It is easy to imagine judgment as something loud, dramatic, and obvious: earthquakes splitting the ground, storms swallowing cities, disasters tearing across the map. But Wilkerson insisted that when God shakes a nation, the tremors begin in places far more fragile than buildings or borders. They begin in the unseen, in trust, in truth, in the silent architecture of the human heart. And when that unseen structure breaks, everything built upon it begins to collapse. For years, Wilkerson warned that America would face a shaking so deep and so total that even the strongest institutions would seem to buckle. Not because of outside enemies, not because of invading armies or global conspiracies, but because the spiritual foundation of the country had cracked. He said this collapse would begin quietly long before any chart dipped or market fell. It would start with a subtle shift in the soul of the nation, people drifting from conviction, embracing compromise, calling darkness light and light darkness. He believed that when a nation loses its sense of truth, everything thereafter becomes unstable. And so the shaking began where few expected, in the realm of belief. People once anchored in faith found themselves drifting. Churches, once centers of clarity, wavered under the weight of cultural pressure. Messages softened, standards blurred. What was once sin became preference. What was once truth became perspective. And Wilkerson said this erosion would lead to something far more catastrophic than moral confusion. It would open the door to a spiritual darkness that would spill into every area of life. Then came the shaking in the economy. He warned of banks collapsing without warning, of a sudden drop so severe it would send shockwaves around the world. Not a gradual decline, but a violent snap, like a steel cable breaking under invisible strain. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, millions felt the tremor. Jobs vanished, homes disappeared, savings evaporated. The world economy staggered, gasping for breath. But Wilkerson said that moment was only the beginning, a foreshadow, not a fulfillment. He said the next collapse would not simply drain people's wallets, it would drain their illusions. He foresaw a day when trust in institutions would evaporate, when the systems people depended on would be revealed as fragile, unstable, and incapable of offering real security. That collapse, he believed, would be a spiritual judgment wrapped inside an economic one. A moment when God allows the idols of a nation to fall, not to destroy the people, but to call them back to himself. He called it judgment with mercy, a breaking designed to awaken, not to annihilate. And now, as the nation faces rising inflation, suffocating debt, and an economic tension that feels like a held breath, many sense that something deeper is trembling beneath the numbers. It is not just the price of food or housing climbing into the heavens, it is the collapse of confidence. The uneasy awareness that the ground beneath us may not be as solid as we once believed. But Wilkerson's warnings reached beyond money and morality. They pierced into the heart of the church itself. He said that before the world collapses, the church would experience a shaking of its own, a separation, a purging, a moment when superficial faith would crumble, leaving only what was unshakable. He believed God would expose things hidden in pulpits, leadership, and congregations, not to humiliate, but to cleanse. And in recent years, the wave of scandals, cover-ups, and compromises ripping through churches has shaken believers to the core. It is painful to watch, painful to admit. But Wilkerson said the pain was part of the mercy, because God, like a surgeon, sometimes cuts in order to heal. He said a time would come when even the righteous, those who truly sought to live faithfully, would be shaken. Not ruined, but tested. Not cast down, but refined. He quoted the ancient words, "Everything that can be shaken will be shaken, so that what cannot be shaken may remain." And today, that shaking feels personal. It no longer lives in distant headlines. It lives in homes, families, marriages, friendships. Believers face pressures they never imagined. Financial strain pulling at the seams of stability. Division slicing through households. Loneliness creeping into the corners of the heart. Doubt whispering in the quiet moments of the night. Wilkerson said this would happen not to break the faithful, but to burn away everything weak, false, or superficial. To forge a faith that cannot be shaken because it stands on something more substantial than comfort or circumstances. The shaking, he believed, is not punishment, it is preparation. But preparation for what? Not for a political solution, not for a leader to rise and restore order. Wilkerson insisted repeatedly that no man, no president, no party, no movement could fix what is broken in the soul of a nation. The shaking was not meant to drive people toward politics, but toward repentance, toward humility, toward a rediscovery of the God they had forgotten in their pursuit of prosperity, security, and power. He said a day would come when the shaking would touch every sphere of life so deeply that people would realize the truth he had spoken for decades. When everything else falls, only God remains. And that realization would not come through peace, but through pressure, through the collapse of idols, through the unraveling of illusions, through storms that reveal the strength or weakness of the foundations beneath our feet. The storm Wilkerson described was never just economic, never just political. It was spiritual, all-encompassing, a shaking that sweeps across bank accounts, beliefs, identities, and institutions. A shaking that does not aim to destroy, but to sift, to separate what is temporary from what is eternal. And when the shaking reaches its peak, when the nation stands exposed, trembling, staggering beneath the weight of its own divisions, Wilkerson believed the final test would come. A test not of leaders, governments, or systems, but of hearts. Because when everything that can be shaken is shaken, the question remains, what will we hold on to? There comes a moment in every storm when the wind stops being a warning and becomes a verdict. A moment when the shaking reaches so deep that even the strongest illusions begin to crack. David Wilkerson believed that such a moment would come to America not as a punishment in the way people imagine judgment, but as a final opportunity, a last invitation to return to what had been forgotten. And he warned that when this moment arrived, everything people leaned on more than God, power, politics, personalities, prosperity would begin to fall like idols tipped from their pedestals. It is here, in this uncomfortable space between collapse and clarity, that the question of Donald Trump reappears. Not as the center of the prophecy, and not as its hero or its villain, but as its test. For years, Wilkerson cautioned that God would allow certain figures to rise, who would force the church to look inward. Figures who would expose not only the fractures in the nation, but the fractures hidden deep within the hearts of believers themselves. He said people would be tempted to place their hope in leaders rather than in God, to attach their identity to politics rather than to the cross, to mistake earthly strength for spiritual salvation. And this, more than anything else, is why many see Trump not as the fulfillment of Wilkerson's warnings, but as the mirror that reveals their full weight. His rise exposed how easily people can shift their trust from heaven to earth, from Christ to charisma, from truth to tribalism. It exposed how quickly Christians could divide over a man, how swiftly churches could fracture over loyalties, and how naturally people could elevate a leader, whether they loved him or despised him, into a place of spiritual significance he was never meant to occupy. Wilkerson warned that this would be the temptation of the final shaking, to choose a human savior, to cling to someone visible when the invisible felt too distant, to follow a personality when following God felt too demanding, to look for a rescuer with power rather than a redeemer with truth. And so the question at the center of this storm is not, was Trump the fulfillment of prophecy? The question is far more piercing. What did our response to him reveal about us? Did we cling to truth, or did we cling to a tribe? Did we defend righteousness, or did we defend our side? Did we seek God's voice, or the voice that echoed our feelings? Did we place our trust in the eternal, or in someone who could never carry the weight of our hope? This is why Wilkerson's message feels heavier now than when he first spoke it, because the shaking is no longer theoretical, it is happening in real time, in hearts that feel stretched, burdened, and uncertain. People look around and see division growing sharper, trust dissolving faster, and deception spreading wider. They see chaos masquerading as clarity, confusion replacing conviction, and fear overwhelming discernment. And somewhere in the midst of that confusion, Wilkerson's voice rises again, not loud, but steady. He said the final shaking would reveal what people truly trust, not what they say they believe, what they actually stand on when everything else collapses. When leaders fall, when systems fail, when the future darkens, when the anchors we thought were secure begin to break loose, he warned the church that it would be tested first, that believers would be sifted, not to destroy them, but to refine them, that God would peel back every layer of false comfort until only true faith remained. He said that in the final test, Christians would face a question far more intimate than politics or prophecy. When the last idol falls, will Christ still be enough? This is the heart of the shaking. This is the core of Wilkerson's burden. This is the truth many have tried to avoid. Because when the noise of the nation reaches its highest pitch, when arguments replace compassion, when fear drowns out wisdom, when outrage becomes the language of daily life, the soul begins to whisper a different question. Where is God in all of this? And Wilkerson's answer, given through tears rather than triumph, was simple: closer than you think, but harder to hear when the world is loud. He believed the shaking would push people to a crossroads where comfort is no longer an option, where compromise is no longer sustainable, where faith must either deepen or die. A place where every false hope collapses so that the only unshakable foundation left is the one many abandon without realizing it, the quiet strength of Christ himself. And so this section slows now, not with fear, but with stillness, not with warning, but with invitation. The storm outside may roar, but storms do not last forever. Even the longest night eventually breaks into morning. There will come a time, Wilkerson said, when the tremors stop, when what was false has fallen away, when what is true stands firm, when the noise fades and the whisper remains. The whisper that has echoed since the beginning of time, return to me. It is in that whisper that mercy lives. It is in that whisper that judgment ends. It is in that whisper that the future begins again. So if the nation feels fractured, if the church feels divided, if hearts feel shaken, it is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of clarity, the beginning of purification, the beginning of a deeper faith that does not depend on leaders, systems, or circumstances. And when the shaking finally settles, those who remain standing will be the ones who learn to let go of idols, let go of personalities, let go of the illusion that any human power could heal what only God can restore. For in the end, the storm Wilkerson saw was not a prophecy of destruction, it was a call to return, a call to trust, a call to stand on the only foundation that cannot be shaken. And in the quiet after the storm, that call still waits, soft as a breath, steady as a heartbeat. Come back, come home, stand on the rock that never moves. A final whisper rising above the fading thunder. When every idol falls, Christ remains.